I hope I won't give you the impression of coming from the Twilight Zone too much tonight. The Twilight Zone, as you might know, the TV show by Rod Serling. Rod Serling lived in but today, my topic is related to some of the discussions we had, but it will be different in tone and different in scope, I think. But again, it should go with any kind of reflection on language and literature. I will be a bit long. Apologies in advance, but in a sense, as long as it is, as we have this kind of weather, you better stay with me, I guess. This lecture is paradoxical optimism. I believe that AI offers a chance for the humanities to strengthen their relevance and their signification. What would be true in general is eminently so today when the level of artificial intelligence we reached with self-learning or so-called self-learning algorithms allow machines to easily generate images, music, objects, films, and texts that were often seen as the hallmark of the human. If we believe that humanistic research is about finding consensus positions, amplifying what others have said previously, labeling good and bad behavior, identifying what has already been identified, expressing simple emotions and effects, mastering a standard style, producing balanced overviews and reviews, describing phenomena without interpreting them, summarizing documents or books, or doing passable translations. If this is what the humanities are about, then this is it. This is over, bye-bye. I mean, that's it. Because right now, generative AI is already able to accomplish these different missions to a degree that is acceptable. The whole question is what is this sort of acceptability, of course. But precisely, I contend that some of us have erred in believing that such were the ultimate tasks of the humanities. And on the contrary, I believe that a maximalist take on scholarship would focus not on generation. So I take very seriously the term generative and generative AI. It's not a focus on generation that we should convey or insist upon within the humanistic scholarship that we practice, but we should put the emphasis on creation as a subject and an object through a differential inquiry into its transformative significations. I'm making a strong distinction between generation and creation, but I will explain that to a large extent, and maybe you won't be fully convinced, but I will make the point over and over again. So let us first rethink how we approach innovation. So let's say that innovation would be the term for any kind of novelty making. So I'm taking it as an umbrella term. Of course, all of these terms could be used differently, just my proposal here. So there is innovation, and within innovation, one can find a random association of ideas, forms, words that could, in fact, generate something novel or something new. We also have trials and errors, which in many contexts, human or non-human, are the main provider for new methods or new approaches, in fact. There is what I prefer to call invention, which consists in reorganizing what has been said, if we are in a linguistic plan. But even invention could be broken into diverse parts, or it could be thought of as a gradient, maybe with or without emergent processes, as there is a wide range between token variations that we could attach to the question of invention and rearrangements that simply reconfigure the given, reconfigure its meanings, its values, its consequences. And then there is creation, or poiesis. Poiesis is the Greek term from which poetry and poetics derive, but it refers to the creation or to the fabrication of something. There is creation which stems from the boundaries of thought, from impossibilities, from contradictions, from both excess and defect, and this is pretty much where novel ideas and practices tend to arise in the arts and in the sciences in their transformative moments. There has long been a complacent view of innovation that has reduced this wide range. I mean, I could do it even wider than that, but this wide range to mainly one type, with the emphasis being put on the incremental, or what epistemologist Thomas Kuhn dubbed normal science for the sciences, but we almost speak about normal humanity, if you wish. It makes no doubt that we, as humans, cannot create non-stop, and that creation is rather an exception to the norm. What I have called elsewhere intellection, or the extraordinary regime of thinking vis-à-vis the regular order of thought that we could name cognition. But is cognition the only thing that there is? Everything boils down to a question of definition, but of course I'm adding intellection to make us rethink the limits of the cognitive. For both theoretical and practical reasons, the majority response these days tends to say that, yes, there is cognition, there is nothing more than that. There is nothing other than that when we think. And the state of the art, or rather, as I will try to explain, the non-artistic state of the art in artificial intelligence is precisely stuck at this question of novelty through cognitive rules, basically, cognitive patterns. Which leaves us with a wonderful device, generative AI, that is wonderful in the strict sense, but that is also heavily contributing to actively diminish the amplitude and variety of human reflection in telling us that this is what we do. This is the only thing we do. It principally brings down the noetic to one conceptualization of the mind. And in parallel, as long as we will sheepishly accept to be constantly reshaped by algorithms coming from social media or the algorithms of bureaucracy, we will also have prepared ourselves and our minds to be much more similar to the next chatbot. That's the other part of the question here. Since that chatbot is partaking in the ongoing reprogramming of human mental capabilities and sort of narrowing things down. But there are differences between, for instance, writing paragraphs filled with word repetitions, writing a redundant prose poem, writing a text in the style of Goethe's, and creating Goethe's style to begin with. Undoubtedly, the GPTs of the present and the future can do and will do a pretty passable pastiche of what has been said, which is why so much of the social parlance, from op-eds to social media moments of first-person proclamations, are in fact already so easy to reproduce with only a few comments to the electronic system. But what about the adventure of the unsaid, its performance and its interpretation? About that, the humanities have something else to say, something incompatible with the standardization of mediocrity that computerized techniques are able to produce and to multiply. That's the institutional moment for a few minutes now. It might well turn out that the humanities as an academic field, so that includes the study of literature and the study of languages, it may well turn out that the field of the humanities, especially in the US, will soon recede even further, and that digital innovations, including generative AI, would play a key role in such a demise, directly or not. This gloomy prospect is highly probable, we all know that. I do not intend to avoid it. I am not even arguing for a sort of smooth and peaceful relation between the tech and the humanities. And I am not suggesting that letting be wise or smart. Rather the opposite. A strife is unavoidable, and I doubt an armistice is anywhere near. But all of this is true, but in our specific moment, we could see with extreme sharpness what discursive scholarship is bringing to us, why it matters, and how it thrives, including by comparing it to what the generator is giving us. So my optimism is there, it exists, it is paradoxical, as acknowledges that AI nullifies what many practitioners consider to be humanistic research. And concurrently, AI, probably as much as a reality as a rhetorical ploy, might be used, no doubt, by academic power to cause extensive harm to the very idea of the transformative humanities. But at the same time, as long as we wish to think further than the limitations of the given, the impetus for the humanities remains as virtually the only horizon for making sense of what we are and could be. And in different way, I heard that position to some extent today, coming from several speakers. By contrast with the humanities, at least in their maximalist sense, the one-dimensional narrowness of the most advanced AI is striking. Yes, we could fully habituate ourselves to the pale and reassuring normalcy of computerized outputs. We are deeply engaged in that direction, with or without GPT. And we could even train ourselves anew so that we would become closer to the functioning of our own models or our own devices, and even implant more electrodes in our cortex. You know that there is a famous billionaire who is working on that right now. He's not the first one to do it. Or we could couple cerebral organoids. That's a picture of an organoid, which is a euphemistic name for sections of brains that are being engineered on the basis of cells in a vat, basically. And we could even do, that's one proposition coming from a recent article, we could couple an organoid with electrodes so that we would see, I quote here, how a 3D brain cell culture can be made more computer-like. So we could go into that direction. But there remains that the other modes of thinking, the ones that diverge from their algorithmic deployment, including the computerized techniques, show the possibility of and the need for an outside to our ultimate transformation into the adjuvants or the universal fact-checkers of the brains we shall engineer. And that the brain would be wet or not wet doesn't matter so much in this respect. Love in the Time of Cholera, the novel by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. You inferred that I was using the title here and that it was inspiring mine. This novel is not first and foremost a chronicle or historical chronicle of a certain era marked by a pandemic. The Time of Cholera that is indicated in the title is also qualified by the subjective impressions of the circumstances themselves. And it remains, in fact, in the plural form in the Spanish original, los tiempos being a plural form, contrary to what we have in English, or in French, by the way. As for the junction with love, as in Alain Resnais's and Marguerite Duras' movie from the 50s, Hiroshima, Mon Amour, it does not suggest that the plague in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's case, or the atomic bomb in Duras' case, that the plague or the bomb are the fuel of passion. But it rather reminds us that even in the worst times, we can love. And the final pages of Gabriel Garcia Marquez's narrative even show how the threat of contagion could provide an improbable support to a long-delayed relation, as the two aged lovers aboard a ship flying the yellow flag enjoy a cruise that could last for their entire life. Entire life is the term in Spanish. It's translated completely differently in English, by the way. In its turn, the time of AI is not exclusively a chronological period, and it's not, and it is providing a counterintuitive support, not for love, maybe for love, but for the humanities at least, or for the love for the humanities. AI is currently spreading like a plague. We did not need it to think, but it is there, and against all odds, we can use its noun and its reality to try to recreate scholarship. So I'm reaching the end of my long introduction. The rest of the lecture will be composed of first a sort of relatively consistent and constant appeal to a sort of to a kind of paradox, a theoretical consideration that I wish to emphasize, that AI is us and that we are not AI, and that the two should go together. And And the fact that they would go together has consequences for the definitions of the human that we necessarily posit in the term humanities, even if we want to avoid an anthropomorphic or anthropocentric definition of the humanities. The main point here is to distinguish generation from creation. My contention being that the artificial intelligence that we have does not create. And I will follow that, which is rather theoretical, by two empirical considerations, keeping in mind that most of us here are in literary and language studies. So the first case I will explore with you briefly is tied to an experiment I have led recently on the generation and the creation of poetry in English. And the other will offer a brief set of reflections on automated translations and what it does and does not bring us as humanists, as literary critics, as linguists, as philologists. To this day, it is important to say that there is no artificial intelligence. If we take it as a human-made autonomous agent that would show understanding and comprehension of the world, that's done. But were we to stay closer to the Latin etymology of intelligence and interpret the term as the faculty of selecting and linking relevant data, interlegere, meaning this sort of selection and linkage, then artificial intelligence is here, has been here for quite some time, because computer science has reached that goal of selection and linkage for quite some time. But there is a lot of room, as you would easily guess, between those conceptions of intelligence, the absolutely autonomous agent on the one hand and the linkage on the, and selection on the other hand. The initials that we use constantly, which are in between a password and a code name, two letters standing for a noun that is not often fully uttered, less and less fully uttered. The initials register the ambivalence. Basically, we move from artificial intelligence to AI. In this lecture, AI mainly refers to non-living machines supporting and emulating mental operations, to the theories permitting them, and by implication to human interactions with them. So there are obvious massive differences between the kinds of AI that have been or that could be developed in the future. One remarkable point of divergence is about the degree of specificity, for instance. From the potentially powerful software designed for a domain, such as playing chess, or to announce the announcement for the rest of the talk, it's relatively easy to create a software that will write poetry, but it's a domain-based one. It's different if it's what we have now, which is the large language model, that does not really model human language, contrary to the name. I mean, most of those names are, in fact, more like commercial names, I would say, in between technological and commercial names. But the large language models are capable of varied output. And of course, we might think of what is called AGI, artificial general intelligence, that would supposedly draw inferences from separate faculties. Every month, someone is saying, we have finally reached the point of AGI, and then the other part of the community says it's overselling, we are not there yet, and so on. So those are different kinds of AI. Another concurring and noticeable difference in the constitution of AI would come from from the introduction of self-learning algorithms. But it's important to remember that those self-learning algorithms are not currently left completely to their own devices, and that they are still, not only are they still programmed to self-train, so there is still a program somewhere at the very beginning, but also it comes now with moments of interventions, reinforcement learning, and fine-tuning. So you have here just a representation of that's for the large language models on the left, including GPT, with this level of input and data mining that is giving you an output through those layers. That's the transformer architecture, and you have a sort of diagrammatic representation on the other side of the human interventions that are more and more, at least for GPT, for the OpenAI products that are more and more relied upon. So you have more and more human interventions in fine-tuning or reinforcement learning. There are other kinds of internal divergences, especially with regards to future research. So I'm not going to give you a full list of that. That's not really important. What I'm saying is that although those differences exist, although those differences have tremendous consequences on the tech level and sometimes on the industrial level, I don't think that they matter so much today for the kind of discourse we could have about generative AI. So it's slightly deceptive. I showed you the differences to say that they don't matter so much. The thing to do, I believe, here is to reflect further on the degrees of separation between AI and us, and to avoid wholly setting apart one from the other, or to avoid saying that they are the same thing. So that's why I'm saying those two things at once, that AI is us and that we are not AI. Well, you what you want of this wonderful illustration. So AI is us. In any case, AI is not us. We are intertwined with it in several ways. First of all, the creature has been originally designed by humans, it's obvious, but designed by humans with all their cognitive, technical, social, and political limitations. It is the case that those technical limitations exist, but we should not forget that there are social, political, historical limitations as well, that they are being put into the construction. As machines are now able to code, even though people who code are usually unhappy with the way they code, but one could imagine future artificial entities that would be programmed and eventually built or printed by AI. Why not? But even that would not be enough to consider that we had nothing to do with such a production, in the same way that the science fiction representation of the evil robot escaping human control, know that one, would suffice to exonerate Homo sapiens for its own responsibility. That's the conclusion of the sci-fi movie. We are still responsible. Would the mechanical brain display agency through, well, I doubt it would happen, but let's say it would happen, then our own plans, fantasies, hopes, and fears would still be inscribed within this kind of agency, to such a degree that humans could recognize themselves in this dissimilar other. More precisely, the development of AI has been strictly joined to an inquiry about the living mind. So I'm leaving sci-fi aside for a few minutes. While cognitive science originally benefited from the progress of computerization, the advent of cognitive science would not have been possible in the 50s, 60s without computerization. The whole field of artificial intelligence, on the other hand, has never stopped relying on experimental psychology, or what it was grasping from experimental psychology, for its own sense. Automated content generators offer us then a certain vision of ourselves that looks passably familiar, which would not happen if these machines were operating on a completely, absolutely different plane. In addition, obviously, the large language models and any other comparable technical strategy, self-learning structures with data mining, are in the first place a function of their training set, and we collectively have been provided for that. The billions of parameters that the industry is vaunting are learned from immense collections of human-made artifacts, text, pictures, sounds, movies, and so on. There would be no GPT output of any sort without the records of the collective achievements of our species predating actual AI. Finally, we are and we will be collaborating so much with our mechanical extensions that we can only be transformed by our transformers. Beside the feedback circuit that allows users to re-inject their assessment into the machine by selecting the best answer or the best version that they get on their screen, computerized content and processes make their re-entry into the human minds, which cannot be without consequences. We don't completely know what those consequences are today. So we can only admit that we are already in the machine or that it is in us. Thus, we cannot content ourselves with a simple opposition between the humanities and computerized technology. We are rather dealing with different protractions of the human, with different theories theories of the mind. That's really the point I want to push here. There is, therefore, the possibility for an ongoing strife. It is not the fight of the discursive disciplines or the traditionalists, let's say, against the capitalistic and tech forces or the good forces of information science. It is not the fight of subjectivity or touchy-feeling humanists against objective rational beings who would be engineers. It cannot be like this. Moreover, within the corpus of the humanities themselves, we would have no difficulty at all to find enshrined conceptions of the human mind or self that are fully compatible with the oblique portrait of ourselves that generative AI is showing us. From a humanistic perspective, the reality and the discourse of artificial intelligence cannot be perceived as an outside enemy, but I add it cannot be perceived as a foreign ally. It's not a foreign ally, it is also us, so it's not the next entity, and it cannot be conceived as a transparent transcription of the philosophical either. It's something else. It's neither of those three possibilities. If we fall prey to a parallax error of that kind by putting those things that are different into one or into two, we shall be unable to articulate our own position, and we'll either end up defending a camp whose raison d'être would be social, or ending de facto the very singularity of our scholarship. Through the technical implementation of theories, including humanistic theories, AI reveals what was not concealed so well, and everything we do, in fact, that we can outsource to the machine is, I believe, in effect, secondary to the life of thinking. So it's like putting to the test. Everything we can outsource to AI, well, maybe we could. Maybe that was more peripheral than we thought. Our humanistic complicity with AI is, however, no equality, and that's where we are not AI. We are related, but we are different. AI is us, but we are not AI. As illusory as the claim of total decoupling between AI and the human is the insistent and false promise of a functional identity of all minds, be they organic or not. That's the regular terms that you have in the sciences and beyond, such as the brain that would be called a Turing machine or a prediction machine, or you speak about the neural networks of a computer, or you speak about the large language models, although they are not modeling language. So nevertheless, even beyond our biological fact, we are not computers. Many arguments on the topic have been put forward, many of them, so you know some of them. I'm not going to dwell on that, but the common critique of the large language models is that they have no emotion, they have no consciousness, they display no experience of the world, they have no judgment of what is right or wrong. Interestingly, those four criteria are just unfrozen from Aristotelian times to a large extent, so it's not exactly a very new discussion, although Aristotle was not using computers very often. You also have those more technical doubts about performance collapse, pervasive biases that you find in generative AI, hallucinations, what is called catastrophic forgetting, and the fact that there is a very heavy computational load for large language models, which has implication for the ecosystem. So all of this is true. I'm not going to explain any of this because, in a sense, this is what most people talk about. So I thought I would give you a lecture that would not be the GPT version of the debate. So I'm not losing from view these criteria. I'm not forgetting about privacy. I'm not forgetting about security. All those things matter. But I would like to concentrate personally on a series of 7 different features that are limitations in generative AI, but tied to the question of we are not AI. And the first one is that the large language models and anything like the large language models are anchored in the past. That is that the training corpus, I will try to show it a bit more obviously with the poems in 5 to 7 minutes. The training corpus strictly defines what will be produced, subjugating in advance any future production to what has been previously said. Novelty, then, is based on composite variations. You remember the slide about innovation, so we are at that level of possibly invention at most. Two, the generation model is concurrently probabilistic. I mean, it's based on probabilities. Therefore, it confers a higher value to the ordinary, because the ordinary is more probable. Three, in this context, neither plurality nor what I call singularity are performed through generated texts, images, films, or sounds. The emphasis is on impersonal expression, an impersonal expression that is drawn from the reassembling and the standardization of majority trends in a corpus, plus the supervision of human players, I mean the reinforcement learning phase, but those human players are desubjectivized since they are poorly paid engineers that have to say, to label what is good, what is not good, according to another external set of guidelines. Fourth point, integration, such as the consolidation of a general design, the ongoing reinterpretation of the text as it is written, or the overarching trajectory of a theory, all of this is missing from the LLM because what they produce is an incremental token by token text. I saw that Sam Altman is saying, yeah, but the new product has that. Well, I have not worked on it, but I seriously doubt it. Fifth remark, in whatever form, present or future, and beside the specific status of large language models, AI and generative AI is intrinsically algorithmic. I want to dispute that. It's a bit of a technical point, but it's important because decades of research in psychology on cognition in animals, that includes us, certainly support the existence of something we might wish to call an algorithmic brain or an algorithmic mind in living agents. But I have proposed that automated cognition is not the only thing that there is, and that it is exceeded or bypassed through its performance. The creative capability that we can display is not independent from the cognitive, from the routine, from the ordinary. It overrides it, which means that it needs it, but it's different because it overrides it. This is the exception to the norm, and the kind of generative AI we have today is confining ourselves to the norm. There's just no way out of it. It's operated, it's not performed, if you wish. Six, there is in us, and that's directly tied to the previous point, there is in us the potentiality for conquering plurality of noetic regimes. So we have different modes of thinking, different modes of thought, and we can use them. And AI is just retaining one, the one that is easier to implement on a computer, and the one that happens to be the dominant paradigm in psychology. It's not a coincidence, of course. Happens to be was ironical. And the last point is that a text, which is important for us, I think, in our context today, a text does not, in fact, contain meaning. It mainly provokes it in the reader's mind, and it may have shaped it in the writer's brain. So there is a difference for me between sense, meaning, signification, and significance. As for signification, it is locally enacted, while significance would be what is experienced, the significance of a text, for instance. The text generator finds no meaning. It just deducts items on the basis of discursive word distribution. In fact, this is mapped onto integers, onto numbers as well. The attribution of signification, and the attribution of signification is more than mapping, predicting, or extracting vectors, is what we do when we read the text, when we hear people, and it's currently outside of what AI could do. But we can attribute that signification to the text that AI has produced. And we could even interpret the computerized utterances we are being presented with, not only read them, but really interpret them. One could even imagine subsections of future literature departments that would be devoted to that task. That's the subsection of your literature department, the studies of AI-generated texts. I think the novelty would fade, but interestingly, in his seminal 1947 lecture on the automatic computing engine, Alan Turing is already speaking of that. he assigns those who work with the calculator, so that's the early calculator in 46, 47, to either one of two classes. So one class is what he calls the masters, and the other class is what he calls the servants. The servants are the people who feed the machine with information. The masters are the one who build the machine. That's what this lecture is saying. Turing adds, as time goes on, the calculator itself will take over the functions both of masters and of servants, end of quote. He also specifies it may happen, however, that the masters will refuse to do this. That is saying, thank you so much, Mr. Calculator. I'm so glad to become a kind of servant now. They may be unwilling to let their jobs be stolen from them in this way. I think that a reaction of this kind is a real danger. Again, the danger is the reaction from the masters, not the fact that the jobs would be cancelled or stolen. A few years later, while he was speaking to a larger audience on the BBC radio, Turing is exploring the same idea with a slightly different rhetoric. So exeunt, masters and servants, is slightly polemical. So he has now, the masters of the computer are now called the intellectuals. And the British scientist notes that the intellectuals might be afraid of putting out of jobs by the computer. That's a quote that you have here. But he clarifies that those intellectuals who might be afraid of being put out of jobs would be mistaken about this because they would gain a brand new function that Turing, in fact, found just before reading for the BBC his own speech. So he added that with a pen. So that's the moment of genius just before speaking in front of the mic. What the intellectuals could do in the future would be to trying to understand what the machines were trying to say. But in fact, current generative AI is not trying to say anything. I mean, let's be cautious with the terms, trying to understand what the machines were trying to say. So you see the mirroring effect rhetorically, and you have machines trying to say something, according to Turing. AI is just has its try at saying things we might recognize, might attribute meaning to. Outside of the simple, though valid biological differentiation between our own animal species and our own computers, and beyond the manifest divergence in terms of implementation, the reason why we are not AI, in fact, could only be a consequence of what we do or what we do not create. So that's the idea of the essay entitled Humanities in the Time of AI that will be out in spring. I don't know exactly when, but soon, I hope. So the remainder of this, no, not yet. The remainder of this lecture will be a bit more practical in a sense. I will move away to some extent from the theoretical plane, and I will touch on these two case studies that I announced. In a recent Humanities lab experiment at Cornell that I co-led with my colleague in psychology and cognitive science, Morten Christiansen, and information science, we asked GPT Instruct, as well as students, college students, Cornell students, to generate poems in English on the basis of lines that were authored by published writers, in fact, canonical writers in English. This was a New Frontiers grant that we got. I mean, we were speaking about the infrastructure that some rich universities could bring. So we got one of those New Frontiers from the College of Arts and Sciences at Cornell. It involved another conference participant, Jacob Matthews, who is going to speak about something else tomorrow. And my recent article in Harper's Magazine that was entitled Metal Music Machine is giving a sort of narrative description of the experiment. If you want to read the narrative, it's there. If you want to read the science article, it's not published yet. I would hope it would be published already, but that's not the case. the more we move away from the solitary work of the humanists and we are entering collaboration, the more we discover the joy and pleasure of working with different people and sometimes the additional time an activity is taking. So just presenting a few examples of this generation of poems. And I'm beginning with a poem by Claude Mackay. So what we did was that we selected, I'm not going to explain how we did it, maybe in the Q&A if you have an interest, but we selected some authors and we selected some texts by some authors in the vast corpus of literature and poetry in English. And we asked GPT at the time when we did the good batch of texts we used, it was GPT Instruct, so sort of GPT-3+. And we asked also human participants to read some texts by the authors and then to continue in the style of each author a given poem. So you have each time 2 lines, which is the prompt. And then you have 2 or more than 2 lines that are being generated, unfortunately not created, generated by either GPT or by a wonderful Cornell undergrad. So we are beginning with Claude Mackay, and we are beginning with the best example we had pretty much about in a crowd of several thousands. So you will be impressed, but then I will try to deflate your enthusiasm. So we're beginning with Claude Mackay writing, "Where in the starlit stillness we lay mute and heard the whispering showers all night long." And GPT is continuing, "And up and down the coast the surf was fluid. Against the reefs a music faint and strong." End of quote, which is probably quite remarkable. Also because you see rhymes. I'm not going to go into that, but getting rhymes from GPT-3 was very complicated. We have even iambic structures that accordingly follow the first 2 lines. And more important to a certain extent, or equally important, the motif of the humanized sound of nature, which is introduced by Mackay's phrase on the whispering showers, lead to the flute and the music of the surf against the reefs. All these words, by the way, are being strengthened by the alliterative recurrence of the F sound. But there is no representation of sound in GPT. So all of this is quite remarkable. It is because of generating texts of that kind that it has become hard for me to speak of the AI transformer as a pure stochastic parrot. You might know the term stochastic parrot. It's a phrase coming from an engineer, computer scientist, Emily Bender. In a sense, I would like it to be a stochastic parrot. It would make my life easier, but that's, I believe that it's not exactly parroting in a random manner that gives us this kind of text. I also have to say that when that stanza appeared on my screen and when it was generated, I was also more impressed by it because it was coming after months previously spent at examining more botched attempts, such as these fake Emily Dickinson poem that you're going to see. I mean, some of you may have seen it if you read the Harper's article. So that's beginning with Emily Dickinson, "Far as the east from even, dim as the border star," and then GPT is adding, "Life is the little creature that carries the great cigar," which is not as good. So as we went through different phases of, in terms of poem generations, we first started with GPT-3 because there was only GPT-3 in town. So when we began with that, the last batch we crafted in 2022, the one with GPT Instruct, was markedly more convincing, if you wish, than our initial attempts could be. I mean, the initial attempts were so poor that, in fact, there was no point in even running the experiment with humans and asking them, is this generated by, was just meaningless. I would say, paradoxically, I cannot prove it, but I believe that GPT-4 or 4.0 iterations today will probably represent a step backward, mainly due to the now very, very heavy constrictions on content production that have been implemented through human reinforcement. But still, our best batch, the one that we drew from for the experiment, that produced, for instance, the Mackay that you saw, also incorporated a very large number of direct recitations. That is, the machine would give us not a continuation in the style of the author as requested, but the rest of the original. So it would just recite. And that's a type of completion that word probabilities in the abstract could not entirely explain. So there might be a discrepancy between the description. Now more and more computer scientists have been working on that, but there clearly are a few discrepancies between the description of the model and how the model actually works. Maybe OpenAI was not open. Who knows? But in addition to those recitations, we also had more covered rhapsodies, such as the following stanza by Robert Whitman. So you might know and recognize the first two lines of Salut au monde in Leaves of Grass. Oh, take my hand, Walt Whitman, such guiding wonders, such sights and sounds. And here is the follow-up by GPT Instruct. Such joined, such friendly earth and sky. Oh, take my hand, Walt Whitman, for I too carol the sun, ushered or at noon, or as now setting. I too throb to the brain and beauty of the earth and of all the growths of the earth. I too have felt the resistless call of myself. So take my hand, Walt Whitman, and join me in these friendly earth and sky. So that's sometimes GPT is generating more than 2 lines. So it looks quite good. The problem is that this lyrical burst is almost exclusively a collage. Immediately after the quotes, the prompt, the start of the third line, such joined, is in fact the third line of the original poem that appears here. And then it is interspersed with repetitions of the prompt, oh, take my hand, Walt Whitman, or so, take my hand, Walt Whitman. And we have, with the 3 I too, which are quite good, in fact, they are quite good because they are being uplifted verbatim from another poem by Walt Whitman, Song at Sunset. So over 7 verses, no. So over 7 verses, yes, you see it a bit better there. So the gray is what GPT has added. All the rest is coming from Whitman in one way or the other. So the more personal contribution from GPT Instruct essentially boils down to the insertion of the phrase friendly earth and sky and the words for, so, and this. Plus, if you wish to be generous, the Duchampian assemblage, I'm not saying that GPT has Marcel Duchamp in mind. But, so we are encountering here, and you will see a resonance with something we heard about through the Odyssey. So we are, earlier today, we are encountering here a striking case of what is called corpus memorization in generative AI. The tech industry, you speak about memorization, and that's a problem in a sense. Mnemosyne, is remembrance in Greek, is the name of the mother of the muses, or the name of the muse par excellence. So as in the first line of the Odyssey, we saw an English translation earlier today. The muse would give the words to speak, to tell and retell things from the past so that we could remember mnemosyne. Memorization is not the same as mnemosyne, remembrance. So I'm saying we have 2 muses now. Memorization is our new automated muse, and she's more of a cheater than mnemosyne was. She reminds less than she recites. And in fact, some colleagues at Cornell have recently but firmly established that large language models have indeed memorized entire texts, while the interface usually refuses to recite poems in first pass. So you ask the interface to recite Song at Sunset by Whitman. GPT is saying, I cannot do that because I don't know the text, and so on. So although the first answer is no, you can convince, if you wish, you can give a prompt that will give you, in fact, the text. And so it has been very well established, not only by those people in David Yuno's lab, but also by others, that the system is able to take the task and is able to reproduce many authors, especially in English, and especially in English, the writers whose oeuvre is featured in the Norton Anthology, and especially one's edition of the Norton Anthology. So the moment the transformer recognizes poetry, I mean, recognizes that is, it could be even at the smallest level, basis of typography, if you wish. It might simply call to itself bits and pieces of other poems, adding, just as we had in the Whitman, a few connectors and just substituting synonyms. This strategy makes for undeniably probable and typical and ordinary continuations, and one could say that they are new in some sense. So it matches the program's industrial and commercial requirements. But on the scientific and humanistic side, is this really the sort of language use and creative work that we, as humanists, would like to extol? Or is it the kind of creation that people in cognitive science would really need to focus upon? So to go back to our experiment, from the start, our experimental design consisted in asking not only GPT to continue lines written by noted poets in English, but also to ask humans. And you know that the usual subject of psychology in the US is the college undergrad, which is the human. I mean, the discipline is making progress these days, but we still tend to be dependent on the college undergrad. So we assembled, in fact, in our experiment, 3 different corpora. We had the original poems written by the authors we selected. We had the stanzas that were produced automatically on the basis of the original prompts. And we had the third corpus, which consisted of the poems written by humans with, let's say, in generous way, an even expertise in literary creation. So we could later ask, that's the part of the Turing test, I'm going to that in a few seconds, would later ask an automated system, but also college students, but also people working through the online platform Prolific, that is regular people who do this kind of cheap labor, cheap cognitive labor. We could also ask a group of literature professors and or published poets if they could attribute authorship when they would see the texts to a machine, to a college student, or to a writer. This protocol is inspired by the tests that Alan Turing described in slightly different terms and that were based on Victorian parlor games that came to be known as the Turing tests. They were introduced by the British mathematician to showcase for the existence, or rather for Turing himself, the lack of an existence of a difference between the human brain and the mechanical computer. But I said very forcefully before that I didn't think that we were, in fact, of a bipolar choice here. And clearly, if one believes, as I do, that some tasks are automated in a wet brain and that others are not, then the opposition human versus machine cannot really exist as such. So we are taking the Turing test that is designed for a sort of binary demonstration to make something else with it, which is a bit tricky. So we don't believe that there is an opposition human versus machine as such. We are not implying that human equals machine, but rather the bet was that untrained students would probably not fare much better in terms of creation than a massive system that would rely on memorization. And in clear, humans do generate texts all the time. We do that all the time. When we speak to each other, we're not creating poems on the spot. I mean, sometimes we do, but it's rare. So we generate, and it is not a surprise that humans would generate text, and that it would be difficult to distinguish them from what a generator would do. So the criterion of distinction is rather the difference between routinely rearranging verbal sequences and transforming words creatively. I'm not saying that there is no... There are all kinds of features probably that distinguish even a low-level generated text by a college student and what GPT is doing. We have not been able to really work on that, but there are paths. I mean, there are. We could discuss that if you wish, but I'm setting that aside here. So interestingly, we found a sort of theoretical bias in our subjects. I mean, the subject that had to evaluate if it were coming from a human who would be a noted poet, a human who would not be a noted poet, or yet, and a generator. So we found a sort of theoretical bias that is implied at the level of the evaluation task. When the college students are facing the original poems. So I'm narrating the relatively complicated results there. So when the college students are facing the original poems that we might tend to consider to be better, they were more inclined than regular participants, the people from the platform Prolific. They were more inclined to say, oh, it's a very good poem, so it should be a GPT poem. On the other hand, when our smaller group, so it's statistically less relevant, but still, you have a signal. When our group of literature professors and published poets were reading texts and generated by humans, by college students, and those texts really sucked. So the published poets and the professors tended to think that probably it was so poor that it was coming from a machine. So clearly here, in the Prolific, the regular people hired through Prolific don't show a sort of bias of this sort. So we see here that there is a theoretical decision, it's implicit, on the part of the evaluators that mirror a preconception about the power of AI on the one hand, or the impossibility that an Ivy League educated student would be unable to write poetry even at a lower level. Overall, I believe that our experiment is contributing to establish first that something operating within language is actually captured through a different route than ours by generative AI. There is something within language that is captured by generative AI. That doesn't mean that the route is the same than our route. If we even believe that our route is one and the same, which is not exactly what I would say. Two, I believe that it tends to show that differences exist in terms of reading and writing. That's not an absolute scoop, but it's a confirmation. Differences exist in terms of reading and writing depending on whom you ask to do a given task. And it's a bit of a trivial point for people who teach literature and language. But many people, including in psychology, would deny that you have gradients of competence to this level. Three, I believe that the judgment on poeticity or on novelty or on interest that we could extrapolate is relying on implied theories of creation. So we might not say we don't think about creation, because clearly the difference of reaction that I mentioned between the published authors and poets on the one hand and the college undergrads on the other hand means that there is a sort of implicit theory about what creation is. Then four, the experiment highlights that the pervasive but still partly misunderstood role of memorization in AI generation, while five, additionally providing further elements of criteriology for the human use of language. But I would add something I've thought to some extent, but I think more strongly now that we have done this 2-year experiment, that no Turing test will ever show that the machine is at, below, or beyond the level of the human in general. That it's just the latter category of the human does not exist for this kind of task. So in a sense, it's an irrelevant claim. Moreover, Turing's very deliberate emphasis on imitation when he designed those tests that have become the sort of hallmark to show the efficiency or the high level of AI, his very deliberate emphasis on imitation is naturally limiting the possibility of seeing creation. So the gaze is on imitation. So the gaze is even preventing us from seeing a lot of creation. Plus, I have to add that we had to do all kinds of practical manipulations ourselves experimentally on our generated corpus. Not saying that we cheat, we didn't cheat, but precisely you had so many moments of recitations. You had also the rhapsodies, such as the Walt Whitman elements I quoted to you. Would we put that to the test? I mean, it would be meaningless. If you say that it's very clearly coming from Whitman, you're right. It's coming from Whitman. It's a collage. If you're saying that it's coming from the computer, you're also right, because it's coming from. So we had to remove the recitations. We had to remove the rhapsodies. We had to remove so many texts by hand to a large extent from the corpus so that it would make sense in the end that I have a bit more skeptical about what you can do with the Turing tests in these settings. The Turing tests, I believe, do not prove much, but they work perfectly for a propaganda machine that downsizes human differentiality and that moves the debate around novel content to a debate dealing with criteria for similarities and imitation. So then you are stopping the original question to a large extent. So I'm nearby the end, but not exactly in the end, sorry. And I'm saying a few words about translation. It will be much briefer than everything else so far. So for languages that are culturally and are linguistically related as well as firmly documented through massive corpora, it is now clear that the large language models architecture is giving an impressive foray to automated translation. It can be used already for some European languages, especially with the degree of success we're discussing at lunch about Japanese. Is Japanese appearing or not? Is it better with GPT-4o to translate or not? But the question is, what does it bring to us? It brings us the ability of this kind of translating machines when we want to order food in Beijing and we're not really able to speak Chinese properly, such as my case one month a year when I'm at Tsinghua, so maybe I see an interest in that. But then for a certain kind of language or certain kind of use of language, certain kind of reflection about language, does it bring us so much? So I'm here introducing the first stanza of the first poem of the Canzoniere by Petrarch. You have the original Italian here. Well, still, voi che ascoltate in rime sparse il suono di quei sospiri ond'io nudriva il core in sul mio primo giovanile errore quando era in parte uoltr'uom da quel chi sono. Then it goes on. So I had asked last year Deep L, you can pronounce it as like you wish, to translate it, and the translation I got was this one that you see here. Ye who hear in scattered rhymes the sound of those sighs whereat I nourished my heart upon my first youthful era, when I was in part another man from what I am, which is, for those of you who read Italian, largely accurate or even impressive translation. Since I was speaking about the cheating muse, I have to remark that this version, as brilliant as it could be, is quite close to one that you could find in a book by Giuseppe Mazzotta. And in fact, I don't know if the miraculous transposition I showed you is anything but plagiarism on the basis of line recognition in the large corpus. You see the difference. It's ye replacing you in Mazzotta's translation, whereat replacing which, upon, and during, and another man from, another man. So it's now in the end. So it's pretty limited. But let us imagine, for the sake of the argument, that in fact it is not a plagiarism of Mazzotta. So that's what Mazzotta found based on his inner computer, based on probabilities, and that's what Deep L found. Okay, let's admit that this is the case. This convergence that we have between two translations, one by a human scholar and one by the computer, would not necessarily, would illustrate the formal features of language that in the intellective space I called the operativity of language. And it would provide to our minds an English text that makes sense and that is not a pointless distortion of the source. So returning to that, you have a third translation there. We'll just speak briefly about this. So now that we have this translation in blue by the, possibly by the LLM, we might reflect on it, and we might reflect on some choices, even though they are not choices as such. For example, should we use ye instead of you, or another from rather than another that to keep a sort of sense of archaisms, and thereby try to mirror in English the historicity of Petrarch's style for someone who would speak contemporary Italian. So that's probably the decision, also to mirror a little bit of a Shakespearean tone. Shakespearean, who was Petrarch, of course. Should a translator make ellipses more explicit? For instance, you have my heart in the deep L translation, but Petrarch writes the heart. I mean, these remarks that I could make others, in fact, could emanate from reflections we would have if we were to read the work of human translators, or even during our own process of translation. I mean, we translate the stanza a first time, then a second time, and we reflect on the choices we made. But I'm not convinced that these automated iteration would necessarily prepare us better to decide if in the first line we should use the verb to hear for ascoltare rather than to listen. And why do we have a simple present and not a progressive form? Those questions would not necessarily come more easily because we have the automated translation. So for Poetry in Mind, one of my books from a few years ago, it was before DeepL, but I was working on the translation and the translatability of that first poem. And with an assistant, we had compiled dozens of human-made translations. Dozens in English, but dozens in other languages as well. And I have to say that in the maybe 50 human-made English translations we had compiled, none of them was opting for the present progressive. I believe I'm opting for the present progressive, but none of them was doing that. And only one out of all of them was choosing to listen rather than to hear. So, so DeepL is logical, I would say. But if Petrarch were using standard parlance, I think this would be completely justifiable. I tend to read the poem in thinking that this is the first poem of a collection. And there is a liminal inscription of the performance of reading that is precisely happening now. That's why I believe it's a present progressive when we move to English. And it is not asking us to hear the sound, but to listen to the sound. I mean, that's part of Petrarchian decision to use sound, which is not exactly what you would associate with poetry, high-level poetry, and to listen. I mean, it's a contradiction, it's a tension, but that's intentional. To listen to the sound of worded sighs, and not only to hear from afar. As for the epithet scattered, it is admissible, but we could have disparate, dispersed, even sparse, why not? Are these terms made more or less convincing than the first impression we could derive from their probabilistic transposition by DeepL? Is the computer here, the computer is clearly facilitating our teaching of the poem, if you wish, but is it facilitating the rhythmic rendition of the flowing fourth line in submitting to us, for instance, the syncopated "when I was in part another man from what I am"? And is this all on the way to a fruitful collaboration we could have, or more like a sort of detour at best, or maybe a waste of time, of energy? Is it bringing us really much more? I'm not sure. In any case, we are again dealing with the interpretive parts of the scholarly modes of translation that AI algorithms tend to discard through the implied information that linguistic utterances are first and foremost probability-based. That is, all the work remains to be done. I mean, all the traditional humanistic work of what does it mean remains to be done. The language that is at stake in philology differs from the language that is implemented in generative AI. And I might write something about that, but you have the first sentence of a new book, perhaps. And so basically we are back to square one. We are back to one of the most fundamental debates that define humanistic scholarship: what is reading, what is understanding, what is meaning, what is the power of literature, and so on. So to conclude, we are often mechanical and automatized. We may even be reprogrammed, and we cannot therefore defend a generic humanness and merely oppose it to the algorithm. Or we cannot simply juxtapose the two, collaboration between the algorithm and the human. Today and tomorrow, AI exposes how ordinary we usually are, but we may also be more than this. And I contend that the compatibility between some and maybe dominant self-qualifications of the humanities and of the human with the program of artificial intelligence can only lead to the actual absorptions of the former by the latter. More guidelines and more policies will not give us more relevance. I mean, we may wish to have more guidelines, but it's not going to give us more relevance. If what we do as humanists is such that it could be easily outputted by an information system. And the political fighting of big tech by academics, which is taking place in a few places, is literally senseless if it takes all manners of humanistic pursuit to be equivalent. In fact, they are not. And it is both logical and just that programs, I'm using the term intentionally, humanistic programs that would demote creation and that would promote repeated patterns, that those kinds of approaches would be replaced by a more performance machine. I mean, if this is the goal, then clearly a machine will be able to achieve that. And that's the cause for my paradoxical optimism. Not only are we now in a position to outsource at least some of the bureaucratic aspects of our own research, but through what it is not and will not become, artificial intelligence is revealing us by difference where are the actual states of the discursive disciplines. So the inner strife I mentioned earlier is in the open, and it behooves us to manifest, show, and demonstrate how humanistic inquiry is a form of exploration and speculation, not only of explication and derivation. How it confronts us with significant plurality, how it expands our reflexive modes of existence, and how it makes us think beyond the boundaries of usual thought. Thank you for your patience.
For distinguishing between a kind of humanity which is one that innovates versus one that generates. And I just wondered if that is something you could speak about.
So I'm not going to make the argument for the Übermensch. I understand your concern. I'm taking it rather from the opposite direction to some extent. I'm going to respond a bit more precisely, but I'm making a slight detour. I have worked in the past, and I'm again working with bonobos, with great apes. And right now, the experiment I have with them is about painting. So I would say that I think of them quite often, and that I believe there might be some creation for them. That is, they might reach here from time to time something that is creative. So the divorce between I'm not saying that the creation has to be reserved to human or even to one category of the human. I'm rather saying that humans oftentimes generate, sometimes we mainly generate, and maybe non-human agents could create. It's not impossible to think that a computerized system could create, but not the ones we have here, in my opinion. And it's not impossible to believe that, especially through the access to the symbolic and to the linguistic, which is the world that those bonobos who have been into a specific experiment have been drawn into, that non-human agents will also create. So I would divorce, I'm not saying that creation is the epitome of the human, but it is something that we are mostly familiar with in the human context. Then to that, I should add, I'm grappling with the question to some extent in the book that will be out with Minnesota, Humanities in Time of AI. Because it's difficult to, when I moved to the US 20 years ago, I never thought I would use the term humanities in any way. I mean, it was so, using that term so often with the human in the center of it was a bit of a theoretical problem to me. But in the definition of the humanities, in the long-standing definition of the humanities, even in the origin of the term humanitas to refer to what we call the humanities now, there is clearly, I mean, there's no way to conceal it, there is clearly a hierarchical viewpoint. And a question, I'm not completely sure we can completely get rid of a sort of hierarchical or a sort of normative viewpoint as long as we use the term humanities. But then the option of using something else has, although that would have been my tendency 20 years ago, now is you know, for instance, post-humanities, I published 2 books in the post-humanities series. But post-humanities is not solving your problem at all. I mean, you're just saying that it's a post. So it makes your life slightly easier for 1 minute, but then it's not there. I use the term, the discursive disciplines in the talk, which I use also sometimes letters, which is closer to les lettres in French. What I tried to do in the book was precisely also to, from time to time, use synonyms or that are not synonyms, but to use terms coming from different languages or even within English that could refer to something that we tend to call the humanities, but that would not necessarily reinstate in every single minute this kind of human center and this kind of hierarchy of the human vis-a-vis the other animals, and the hierarchy of some humans vis-a-vis the, I mean, for instance, the free, it's a Roman concept, so it's really about the free citizen versus the slaves, basically. So there is a sort of very strong inscription there. And I'm not completely sure we can get rid of that inscription, which opens the path for sort of Nietzschean interpretation in that. So I don't know if any of us is completely able to get rid of that. I don't know if we are, I don't think, in fact, that we are able to move away completely from anthropocentrism, although I have, in my work, tried to work with other kinds of animal agents than just humans. But so all of this is there, and I would say we need to grapple with rather than set it aside. But the main concern when I'm speaking in favor of creation, the main concern would be that I'm beginning to be normative, then this is rubbish, this is good, and so on. But to some extent, if we separate the works or the text or the image from the producer of it, I think it's acceptable. It's not, I would not defend that all works are equal and the same. It may be right, but it's different from saying that about the author. So that's, I mean, it's a long response, but I grasp the concern very well. I mean, I understand why the question is coming. Thank you.
for example, or Walt Whitman, what happens when the two of them are combined? Does that become a new kind of thing? And if so, what kind of creativity is that? That's one question. And then thoughts on the copying of human behavior and thoughts on personality embedded in that. Or mannerisms of individuals' mannerisms involved in that.
I want to say something. I think that what the machine added to Whitman, when you find it, there were concepts that are not included. Like the protection of the nature around. That's not included. Whitman doesn't see the world like that.
The machine doesn't see the world in any way. So it's just a token by token thing. So I will return to that. For the first question you asked, if we were to do a merger, and that's one thing that generative artificial intelligence is quite good at, when you write a prompt and you say, please, I don't know, please write in the style of Flaubert a letter from Odysseus to Penelope to say that they want to break up. And I did it. The result is excellent. I mean, there's no doubt about it. So these sorts, but that is coming from the prompt. But one could imagine that there would be a sort of mixture of genres, of tones, of contents and concepts that would come from artificial intelligence. That is, for me, the sort of category of invention I mentioned in the early part of the text, which is the rearrangement. So I believe that the highest level, which is quite good, is a sort of rearrangement. If we want to be generous, that is what is happening with the Whitman as well, that there is a rearrangement. And in these rearrangements, suddenly we as readers could see something emerging that is not there. So that's novelty as well. But I'm a bit less generous with the Whitman, but I believe that rearranging is the best we would get, which is, or transposing. I mean, transposing a discipline to another, for instance. I don't know. I mean, someone I know who got the Nobel Prize. We were students at the same time in Paris. Esther Duflo, who is studying economy. She used the technology of the RCT with her advisor, who is also her husband now. But she used the technology of the RCT that is mainly used by big pharma to work on social and economical issues. That's a transposition. That's an invention. I don't think that's a creation, but that's really something that is happening there. I don't think that GPT is able to do that. But just to mention a level of transposition that gets you the Nobel Prize when you are in your 40s, so it's still quite good. You know, it's a good level. At least there is a mass of people who think that there is an interest in it. So rearranging is where things would be the most novel. That's what I would say. Yes.
I have to confess something. I saw one day on the internet some paintings. Obviously, they are not really paintings, but taking pieces from several paintings, and they build a much more beautiful painting than those from where they have taken the pieces. I mean, does the machine? I think it depends on how you program the machine, and if you have a high level of taste in beauty, and it depends on who is programming or inserting data that you want the machine to use. I believe so. I don't know.
No, but the first thing I would say is that we would need to make sure that in fact the machine has generated that image, especially for the image. Many of the AI-generated images that people find impressive are really a sort of collaboration between one or a set of humans, not only on the level of the data, But then you, in the same way you are engineering your prompt, you're saying, oh, it should be darker. That motif should not be in the background, but in the front. And then it's becoming just a computer-assisted creation. I'm miserable at drawing anything. But now I can produce acceptable images because I spent some time for, at least right now it's very low level. It's for a talk. I mean, not this one, that one is a real one. But the one you saw, the fake Michelangelo. Or to create posters for events I'm organizing at Cornell. I mean, that level is okay. But still, it's not the machine generating it from scratch. And so it relates to some extent to Raja's second question about mannerism, because there is this question of style and mannerism that is being, and here I would like to be in a position to argue more objectively. I mean, on the basis of on a statistical basis, I would like to be able to really express what we have found in the poems we have asked GPT-Instruct to generate, also in stylistic terms. What we have seen is that when we ask a software to determine if that text is in the style of the poem of Claude Mackay, there is a range, and so the poems that we submitted to the evaluation of the humans were the ones that automated generator and computer system thought to be the most similar stylistically with the original author. But then one could discuss the way we did it, and one could discuss the measures of similarities as well. But there is a question. Mannerism will necessarily, again, Turing wrote in the late 40s and early 50s, and that's when he's designing these Turing tests. We are now several generations after that. Most computer scientists enter the game when they are studying computer science and engineering with an awareness of the Turing test. So it has even been argued by Gary Marcus, for instance, who is coming from cognitive psychology and who is very vocal against the kind of AI we have. It has been argued by him that, in fact, all good results in the Turing test of any of those transformers would come from a very early conscious decision on the part of the programmers to create objects that would pass the Turing test. So it would just show that they pass a test because the people who conceived of those machines wanted the machines to be able to pass the test, although for Turing, passing the test was just a preliminary step to reflect on artificial intelligence. So it has been argued that in terms of, and there we would find imitations and mannerisms very clearly. So they are quite good at something because it's also a sort of inscription of an early goal that has been implemented in the machine so that the machine would pass the test. Although, as I said, I believe, in fact, the test is a bit irrelevant, despite the large importance of it.
Yes. Thank you so much. Much to think about, and I appreciate you painting with a large brush and trying to also go into the details. And in particular, it's more of a personal question. I was trying to find out, looking at AI more as a communication technology, so how I understand it. How would you describe your communication with AI?
So when we, and that's different from the experiment, since the experiment was really generating a batch of text.
Right,
so that's different.
You communicated with ChatGPT, you communicated with DeepL, however you want to call it. But in a way, is it an interlocutor? Is it a master teacher? Is it a partner? What would you describe that discourse that is happening between you entering? What would that communication? Yeah, what would it be like?
I mean, DeepL is a bit on the side,
It's a little on the side,
but for the other ones, I believe we all made these. Sure, of course. For for those transformers, we all went through that. I mean, I guess all of us have interacted with them. Very quickly, it's becoming more difficult not to attribute any kind of intentions to the system. You remember that a couple of years ago, an engineer from Google was fired because he was caught by the evidence in his mind that there was something in the system. One of the difficulties is that when you work on a mass of data, as we did, or when you work on the theory of production of generations by those machines, you know that it's really a probabilistic computation token by token. And so there is just nothing beyond that, in my opinion. It's just where it is. But when we interact, including me, after some point we are beginning to be annoyed by the lack of response, and we are saying you're just too dumb, or we are beginning not only to attribute meaning to the words that we see, meaning that we're not there in fact, but we are also beginning to attribute volitions, motivations, desires. I mean, that has been quite studied before outside of the computers in experimental psychology. We tend, as humans, to attribute all kinds of agency to things that are not agents as such. And all of our fables and mythical and mythographic texts are full of plants and animals with whom we have very long conversations, although we usually do not speak so much to trees, but sometimes we do it, but in fables and mythographic corpora, we do it quite extensively. So it's part of this extension of agency to these machines. And it's even when you know what it is, or when you think you know what it is, and even when you work on the lack of something new, as on a subjective level, since that was your question, on a subjective level, it's very difficult to deny this sort of feeling of attribution of intentions. So I really feel that but still, it's not necessarily what is happening. And in fact, I don't think it can happen with this kind of architecture. Again, it could happen differently to some extent. But we are caught by it. And it's also because it is happening, at least for us in this arena, it's happening mainly through language. And we have multi-millennial inscription of language in the definition of who we are. I mean, that's the standard definition of the human that we have in the first book of the Politics by Aristotle, of the human as the animal that has language. And so clearly when we are interacting, something is moving. So that's a subjective response to your question about my subjectivity in the process.
Thank you again so much, everybody, for coming, and thank you for a thoughtful presentation. It's dinner time.
Thank you all. Thank you.